Thank you everyone for joining us today. I am so excited because we have Dr. Ellen Kelsey here today, and Ellen is definitely a hero of mine. I'm so excited, one of our environmental heroes. Thank you, Ellen. I'll tell you a little bit about Ellen before we start. Dr. Kelsey is a spokesperson, scholar, and educator in the areas of science-based hope, climate emotions, and environmental solutions. And Ellen actually is a graduate of UBC. She did her MA in science education with Dr. Bob Carlisle, who I also had as a supervisor. And then Ellen did her PhD at King's College London. Ellen has worked at the Vancouver Aquarium. She has worked at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. She's also been a faculty member at the University of Victoria, Royal Roads, and a visiting scholar at Stanford University. So it's my pleasure to welcome Ellen.
Thank you so much. Well, it's wonderful to be here. What a nice thing to say you're somebody's hero. I'm not quite sure what I think about that, but that's a very big compliment and a lovely thing. Maybe I'll think of that as a mentor because I think of the number of people who I'm always finding mentors in the world. So it's lovely to think in those ways. I'm really pleased to be here. And what I was hoping we could do in the time that we have together, and I'm super aware that this is a busy time of year for people and a busy time of day for people. So thank you for making the time to gather like this. I would really welcome your thoughts about how to translate the kinds of ideas that I'd love to share with you into your work, into your research, into your practice. And anything that comes up for you where you say, I'd really like to believe you on that, but I don't, or I'd like to feel this, but I don't, or those kinds of things, because these are really emotion-laden subject matter that is full of feelings and vast life experiences that we all bring. And so for me, that would be the richest way we could do that is you can't hurt my feelings. So I'll say that. And I would really welcome that kind of earnest critique because I think that's how we grow with the kinds of important ideas that we'll be sharing with each other. So I'm going to start just by sharing my screen. And what I typically do, I thought I would sort of be a little bit transparent of why I've put together the presentation the way I have. I have a lot of examples in this presentation, and what you'll notice is that they're very current. I've got timestamps on most of them. And I'm doing that because I really find that our capacity to believe in solutions is quite tied to being able to see the evidence for it. And what I've tried in the past is to use very few slides. And when I do that, I find that people really have trouble believing. They have trouble believing. And so I really need to show lots of current examples. And that's why you'll see that I go through a lot of examples, but I do them quite quickly. I won't belabor them for you. But that's part of the reason I'm showing a lot of examples. Acknowledge with respect the Esalen people whose traditional territory I'm currently coming to you from in a place that is at this point known as Monterey, California. One of the things I think about when I think of territorial acknowledgements or land acknowledgements is what actions are currently going on in these areas that are Indigenous led. And I think this is a really beautiful example, not very far from where I am right now, is a massive movement for a new marine protected area, a really important one off Morro Bay, so just south of Monterey Bay. And this is a really important thing because it's one of a network of marine protected areas, over 19 of them. And this particular one will mean that all the way from, if you take a look on the map, Santa Barbara, all the way up to Mendocino County. That's a huge swack of a huge coastline of a very big state that will be a connected network of marine protected areas. That's a really exciting idea. And it's part and parcel with another thing that's shifting in an important direction. And that is the recovery of sea otters. So southern sea otters, which are unique to Morro Bay, that area which we're looking at for the marine protected area that's Indigenous led. And then here in Monterey, where I currently am talking to you from, the success of the sea otter programs has been so strong that now there is a real active movement afoot to move sea otters back into traditional territories in the San Francisco Bay Area and all the way up into Oregon. So an idea that's been multi-decades in the thinking is now becoming an active project. that really matters, because as we get closer to where you are and where I usually find myself, we see that the return of sea otters has been really influential in terms of the recovery of kelp. And we need that recovery of kelp here in California, just as we need it in British Columbia. So it's exciting to watch that recovery as sea otters have returned along the BC coast, and to think of that recovery not only in terms of fish and healthy ecosystems and fisheries, but also in terms of climate capture. So as these kelp forests return, we see these really impressive carbon impacts of those kind of things. And again, keep track of the dates here. All of this was just between, January till now. And then this program, linking back to Indigenous led and co-led ways in which this is occurring. This is a magnificent program some of you will be aware of, which is this joining together of traditional knowledge keepers and Western scientists who have been working together on, as sea otters are recovering in the BC areas, how do we then make space for appropriate cultural practices that need to be happening as these animals come back into this habitat. And I have a good friend, Tim Tinker, who's been doing the ecological modeling for this. And he talks about, coming so new to this idea of ecological modeling, which brings together Western scientific and traditional knowledge perspectives in a fulsome way that will really determine sea otter management along this coast. So it's really exciting to watch those kinds of shifts. So when I talk to you about that, I wonder, how do you feel when I share stories like that? And this might be a good place, Yvonne, to put in a poll, if you wouldn't mind. Oh, if that's not happening, you could just think about how you feel. That's fine. I ask you that question because of reasons like this. We see research that shows if you have a good knowledge about how something has changed, you tend to be much more optimistic about what you think is possible. And so, on the other hand, we see this impact. So those who feel that climate change, for example, is unstoppable. Oh, great, there's our poll. Feel free to add your ratings in. Oh, I see what's happened. I couldn't see it, but you could. So that's great. Thank you very much, Yvonne, for doing that. Those who feel that climate change is unstoppable, in the same way that those who feel optimistic when they see changes, those who believe climate change is unstoppable are much less likely to engage in the kinds of issues that would in fact stop it. So we end up with really seeing how important our feelings are around all of this. And one of the key points I really want to share with you is our feelings are really impacted not only by what's actually happening, but our mindsets and beliefs about what's happening. And so, for example, this becomes a very important slide. So less than 3% of all the stories we hear about climate change even mention a solution. That's a very, very low number. So it means that almost everything we hear about climate change is in this problem identification frame. And it's not that that's a problem. Problems, of course, are there. These are urgent issues of our times. They're critical issues. But when we only hear about problems, it has an impact on how we feel. Now, this is a widespread problem because we know that climate change problems are deemed more newsworthy than solutions. And we know that the number one way people around the world find out about the environment is through the media. And we see that when these stories just focus on these kind of doom and gloom things, they end up causing us to feel really disempowered. That's a really big impact. And it's not just our media relationship. And that's why I think it's so important that we as a group of teachers and learners get together and think about this, because there's also work like that of a wonderful academic, Leif Kretz, who talks about how cultures of doom and gloom are created in classrooms. And we certainly see this. In fact, we know that students in environmental studies programs that are higher risk for mental health issues because they are not only engaged with a problem-oriented way of understanding their field, but almost everyone teaching them is immersed in a problem orientation. And so it's really a serious emotional and mental health problem as well as a climate engagement problem. What we do know is what really engages people. I'm not sure why the poll keeps jumping up on my screen. Is it doing it for yours as well? I think maybe
Sorry,
we'll just,
Ellen, there were a couple
yes,
little cross glitches there. So the
yeah,
poll
no
results
worries.
should be up right now. And we also had a few folks chime into the chat,
Oh,
feeling
wonderful.
this is good, but is it enough?
Perfect.
Feeling
Right.
warm, feeling excitement.
Got it. And so there's that question of scale, you know, are these small examples that are lovely and they might make you feel good, but are they just small examples? So thank you for this question of scale. And let's come back to that. This issue of scale is really important. And this issue of, you know, what kinds of emotions really do hold us with very difficult to solve problems. And when we look at the psychological literature, we know that in climate change communication, and environmental communication more broadly, we've really focused on fear and shame as primary ways of moving people. And it's not that fear and shame don't work. They do work for certain things like corporate shaming. It's been very effective. There's a lot of interesting work being done in Sweden around flight shaming and what shaming means in a Swedish culture, which is a little bit different than in a Canadian culture. Anyway, but the heavy reliance on fear and shame is the issue. And when you've got something that's really hard to deal with, complicated, wicked problems like climate change or biodiversity loss, what turns out to be much more engaging in the long run is these other things, like feelings of pride, like you're part of something bigger that's having a meaningful impact, and empathy and the kinds of compassion we can extend to one another as we try to do something meaningful. And this is all coming together in this very new discipline. I'd say it's just a couple of years old now, of climate emotions. And there are now hundreds of researchers around the world studying climate emotions. And Panu Pikala is a person I've had a great pleasure of working closely with, a Finnish researcher who's really, I would say, most actively documenting the range of feelings that we have, the complexity of eco-anxiety and the kinds of phase models that it presents itself in, really with this idea that our emotions really do shape the way we engage with these issues. So in the largest study to date that looks at young people, we really do see there that this issue of feeling super fearful about the future and fatalistic about it is a big problem. And additionally, issues of institutional betrayal. And then Ellen Field, who is a researcher at Thunder Bay University, many of you will know her, great person. She just essentially did a very similar study for a cross Canada sample. And when you look at her in this infographic, what she found, it's so worrisome. So there she is, you know, looking at young people between the ages of 16 and 25. 73% think that the future is frightening. 76% think that people have failed to, you know, to take care of the planet. These are high. Half of them thinks that humanity is doomed. These are the kinds of numbers that we are looking at. So this is a big issue. How people feel really matters. And as I mentioned quickly before, it's the fatalistic part of this that I think is additionally problematic. So it's this feeling that not only is it bad, but it's going to stay bad, that it will not change. It's predetermined in some ways, fatalistic. And that hopelessness really leads to cynicism and apathy and disempowerment. In fact, Michael Mann, who is one of the IPCC scientists, talks about this as climate doomism being the new climate denial. Because if you deny that climate change is real, which used to be our big concern, then you don't have to do anything about it. And if you think we're already doomed, you can, again, as a political ploy, not have to do anything about it. And so he's very adamant about this, really raising doomism as a real concern. So again, this is really the point I'd like to emphasize as strongly as I can, that our feelings are absolutely based on the reality of situations. We have massive environmental issues to deal with, and they are based on our mindsets and our beliefs and the ways in which we communicate, and all the things in that second part that we as educators and teachers and learners are so involved with. So this idea that subjective beliefs impact objective reality. There's a wonderful research organization at Stanford University called the Mind Body Lab. And they do research on how the way we think about something and feel about it can actually affect the way our bodies respond. And so work like this, in this kind of genre, where if you believe the COVID-19 vaccine will have a positive effect, you actually on average have a greater immune response. So our bodies are actually responding to what we believe. And so I wanted to ask you about this. Whenever I talk about shifting to a solutions orientation rather than a problem orientation, there's some real common beliefs that keep us focused there. And that unintentionally generates these fatalistic doom feelings. So I just wondered, if you look down this list, if you could think about which of these you might think or believe. If we speak about solutions, we're creating complacency around really important issues. Or a lot of journalists feel that if we speak about solutions, we won't hold power accountable, that we need to point out the problems in order to hold that accountable. Or if we speak about solutions and we're an environmental organization, we won't be able to raise money to solve problems because people will think they aren't really a big problem. Or that the only way to fix something is to study what's broken. So these kinds of beliefs really hold us in this problem identification. And so I think I won't do the poll question, but I will ask you to put into the chat, if you don't mind, what's your theory of change? Like, if you think about, if you really want to change something, you really want to engage people with climate change, for example, or ocean solutions, the theme of our gathering today. And I should say I'm using climate change and ocean issues sort of interrelated because they are so closely tied to one another and they impact each other in such a profound way. But what's your theory of change? One of my current favorite people to follow on this is Eve Tuck. Eve Tuck is a researcher at Oise University. And Eve Tuck talks about this idea of pain stories as a flawed theory of change. And Eve is using them in terms of oppressed communities and talking about, often researchers will come in with great intentions to take a marginalized or underserved community, and on behalf of that community, interview people in that community about the very real issues they face. And when they do that, if they stop there, what she talks about is that that's damage-centered research. You are both only looking at what's broken, and you run the risk of reinforcing this idea of brokenness. And instead, and I think there's a huge parallel here with the way we talk about the environment, that it's really important to understand those great issues that the environment faces or individuals within a community face. But if we stop there, we are really marginalizing the resilience and capacity of those communities of people and those communities of other species. And so I've been enjoying looking for art exhibits, for example, where people are calling this out. I see this as an exhibit exactly saying, I'm not accepting your pain story. I am not tragically colored. I think that's a really interesting idea for us to think about as environmental engagement people. So assuming a fatalistic perspective and positioning hopelessness as a foregone conclusion is not reality. People will often say to me, well, there's reality and there's hope. And I would say, okay, there's maybe, there's wishful thinking and there's reality, but hope is not unrealistic. Evidence-based hope is really looking at the evidence for what kinds of things are moving in the directions we need them to go that we want to amplify. And so we really have to think about this as a mindset of fatalism around doomism that we often call reality. And that can be a real problem.
And
Ellen,
Ellen, we have a number of folks in the chat who've echoed this idea, I think, of hope and looking at taking achievable steps within a community, relevance, changing the way I think about the environment and strengthening my own relationships to the land. And then Thomas notes that appealing to stories of pain doesn't work when those doing the most damage don't necessarily value empathy.
Exactly. Yeah, it's complicated. And I really love Eve's work because it allows me, I'm in awe of researchers who are able to give us words and terms that allow us to then look upon something and say, yeah, what is fraught? What is flawed in this well-intentioned theory that may be, in fact, continuing to reinforce certain privilege and which does not perhaps take a compassionate viewpoint. So again, there is just a lot of research now that shows us, here we have, an overwhelming majority of respondents willing to change, but not confident that those changes will have any impact. So we're in a very different place than we were. And for all these reasons, this is what really drives my work. I really think we have a hope crisis that is as important as the issues themselves. Tony Lesowitz at Yale University calls this a hope gap. So we're now in a position where people feel very strongly about these issues and they feel powerless to do anything about them. And so I wonder again in the chat, if you don't mind, do you recognize this hope gap in yourself or in your students or people you care about? And how you as an educator might help bridge this hope gap? How do you pull that together? So a couple ways I think are really important to this. One is creating safe spaces to share feelings. And I would argue that most of the climate emotions work is in this realm. There's been a lot of work done. I was very happy to co-create a great big website project called the Existential Toolkit for climate justice educators. And it gathers together more than 120 researchers and practitioners working together in climate emotions around creating safe spaces for students and academics and others to share their feelings. So there's lots and lots of resources there from many parts of the world. And, a reminder throughout that was, what have you done for self-care? These happen to be ducks that I live with, who I like to look after. And for some reason, that's part of my self-care regime. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way, but often it does. But the point that I'd like to spend more time with you on today is a part that doesn't get as much attention in the climate emotion research community. And it's this. It's this centering ourselves within current evidence-based content and trends that are moving in the directions we want to amplify. Because I think if we stay in the creating safe spaces realm, which is essential, it's absolutely essential, but it's not enough, because we can unintentionally be reinforcing the idea that the feelings we are having are in direct response to the reality of the circumstance, and therefore we're looking at coping and meaningful resilience and those kinds of things. And I think we need that, and we need to challenge our conceptions of why do we believe what we believe. I'm happy to say there's been a massive growth in this field of journalism called solutions journalism. And there's a wonderful network which has been going on for about 15 years now, I think, which is pulling together journalists from all parts of the world and doing training on how do we rigorously look at not only problems, but rigorously look at solutions. And what's been fascinating to me in that work is, when I was talking about the beliefs, and journalists sometimes believe that they could only use problem identification to hold power accountable. Journalists are now finding, of course, that if you're able to say, hey, this works here, we should have it too, pointing out what works and pointing out how well it works can be a very powerful way to hold those who are not doing those things accountable. I want to underscore that solutions doesn't mean something is fixed or fixed forever. So I think, again, there's a hesitancy for people to talk about a solution because they're afraid that perhaps there are holes within it. I think we want to talk about the things that are moving in the directions we want them to go in, and be very open to when something reveals itself that is not entirely in that direction and course correct. So, but it still doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about the kinds of things that move in those ways. There's been more research now done on solutions journalism to say, what is the impact of that in terms of people's involvement, and lots of work there for those of you who are interested. As an educator, I know you will find this beautiful quote not surprising. The hardest thing we have is when we actually know, right? We're absolutely sure. And I think this is a huge issue around hopefulness. I think people know absolutely that the environment was good and is now worse. Like it's held as a belief. It's held as such a strong belief. And so I'm really fascinated by the work of Gapminder. So Hans Rosling was an academic or a thought leader is what I mean to say. A thought leader who really wrote a wonderful book called Factfulness and was famous for sort of challenging things we think we know. And I love this idea you are probably wrong about. So I wanted to show you an example from this website of something I think they do beautifully. What happened to the annual number of oil spills from tankers worldwide since the 1970s? Has it decreased tenfold, stayed about the same, or increased tenfold? And Gapminder is full of these kinds of questions. Well, it turns out that it has decreased tenfold, but 64% of people across their big surveys get it wrong. And I think this is such a beautiful example of helping us to see that which we are absolutely certain of, we might not know. And I think this is the crux of the matter for this issue around hopefulness. Why is it important for us to know this? Well, people lose hope about the environment if they think that something has just, gotten worse or has stayed the same. And then they talk about why we can trust their data. And I have a meeting coming up with somebody at Gapminder because I'm just such a huge fan. And the woman I'm meeting with is her job title is Chief Ignorance Hunter. So I just think that's just brilliant. So all of this matters because I think we have the starting line fallacy when we talk about the environment. We talk about if we do this, then in the future, these things will get better. And that is a big problem to us. We need to be talking about the kinds of positive actions that have already been at play, as well as our problems, in order to show the directions that we are having an impact. So, for example, giant pandas are no longer endangered. I think that's really profound because they have been the symbol of endangered species, for many, many decades. And what's even more important is the IUCN, so the World Conservation Union, who is responsible for collectively internationally of monitoring the state of endangered species, vulnerable, threatened, those kinds of designations. They are now, since the last 2 years, also saying we not only need to use our red list to show what, how threatened these species are, because pandas are absolutely still under threat, but we need to be measuring which conservation actions are having a positive impact. So they now have this whole green list. And on their green list, they're showing that the population trend is increasing. And they're able to show that these animals are now no longer endangered, but vulnerable. And so they are using both their red list and a green list. And I think that's where we need to be heading, because then you can look. So in this case, this is from 2021, a survey showing huge bird population drops in Europe, right? That's important for us to know. But what I think is equally important is research like this. It shows, okay, but those birds that are recovering, what things are actually helping those birds recover? And that kind of solutions-oriented research that shows legal protection, wow, really important. Site habitat protection, really important. Gives us a direction of what we do about those problems. And too often we stop at just the first, or we only talk about the first. And even when we think about involving our students with, carbon footprints, which looks at how heavily we live on the land. I love carbon handprints, which are the whole system, which is looking at how do we measure what things we're doing that have a positive impact on the things that we care about. So it's adding to this. So I'm really taken by this statistic, especially when you think about Ellen Field's work or that other study, which is looking at people under the age of 25 feeling so fatalistic about the planet. That's a big issue because this is now the world's largest demographic. And what I find very exciting about this demographic is that climate justice, so social justice and climate change, turn out to be the top values across geography and across socioeconomic levels for people in that age demographic. So again, an example of where we might think we know something that maybe we have to challenge. So when we saw the massive climate justice marches that went on just before the pandemic, these were huge, huge events. But because we had a media eclipse during COVID, which simply means we heard mostly about COVID and not about other things, it led many people to think that the climate change issue had sort of gone underground. That's not true. We're now in a position where 1 in 8 people on the planet lives in a place that has declared a climate emergency. That is a massive impact of those marches. And we see research like this that shows, over half of the world's population, 64% believe climate change is a global emergency, right? That's a huge amount of attachment to this issue. But again, this disempowering feeling. We're also seeing a lot of areas where this attention to the issue is shifting. So just in March of this year, we see big legal shifts now going on in important ways. And many of the students that we all teach with or work with have been using legal means to challenge climate change. Net zero pledges. In 2019, 77 countries had made a net zero pledge to get to zero by 2050. When we come up here to 2021, we see that number as much, 140 countries. So again, that doesn't mean that these countries are doing it and it's done, but what it does mean is the momentum around that issue is there. And then a lot of people are concerned about greenwashing with net zero pledges, especially around corporations and cities. What do they really mean it? So it's exciting to know Catherine McKenna, our former Minister of Environment in Canada, is now chairing a massive group in the UN system around greenwashing to hold those pledges accountable. Lots of things going on now in investing and financial markets around movements to renewables and away from fossil fuels. So important to see that shift. And things like this. You know, France fascinates me. Here they are banning fossil fuel ads the same way we banned cigarette ads, you know, in Canada many years ago, but also making it illegal for grocery stores to throw away food and moving that now into other goods as well. We see a real shift going on around energy consumption in Europe. And then in fact, pushing for worldwide phase out of fossil fuels at the next COP. And then this. So this is one of these cases where I feel like this should have been front page news everywhere. You know, that we are at a point where we're thinking that we may be at peak carbon emissions for electricity generation. This is a massive thing, a massive opportunity turning point for global emissions. And yet I would imagine that many of you on the call might not have even heard about this. Is that true? So again, because we just hear about the problem, we don't hear about, you know, when we're talking about scale, that is a massive scale shift, a massive scale shift. And we have changes in science and our understanding of sciences. So it used to be thought that if we got to net zero, by the time we got to net zero, we'd still have many decades of impact. The more current idea now is we will see a relatively quick response when we get to net zero. That's an important shift for us to be aware of and to be talking about. And I think even the IPCC panel coming out for the first time ever in its most recent report saying it's not too late, because they're realizing that these messages of doomism are counterproductive. So it's really a big deal in that way. So what other kinds of things have been happening? Oh, I'll just say, thank you, Elizabeth. My very kind friend has just dropped off something for me. What other kinds of things have happened? Well, one of the unintended consequences of the pandemic has been this real escalation of some very environmental friendly shifts in cities. So the rise of cycling, mass transportation is really on the rise. France again, banning short haul domestic flights. So if you can take a train and get there just as fast, you have to take the train. You're not allowed to take the plane. Big shifts going on in the electrification of shipping. And this is a massive deal for the ocean from my perspective and other people's perspectives, because not only is it important from a climate change perspective and ocean acidification and ocean warming, but it's super important for noise because these electric ships are quiet. And we know that noise is a massive problem for other species in the ocean. And we see, you know, examples happening closer to home. And then this, you know, Airbus now coming out very, very soon with full-size, you know, hydrogen-powered planes. Many of you, including me at this moment, this sweater came from a friend, are wearing clothes that are, you know, thrifted. Lots of people in the age demographic we're talking about are thrifting, to the point where now this is a statistic coming from the fashion industry, not from the environmental organizations, of talking about the rise of resale over fast fashion. So thrifting has really taken off, and the growth of plant-based eating. Plant-based eating is now the #1 trend in food globally. So these are important shifts from a climate perspective. And then things like plastic bag bans. And I think this one really matters to all of us, because how long have we been all talking about, you know, bringing our reusable bags and those kinds of things? Well, it helps to know that we are not alone in this. And then research like this that actually studies what is the impact of these bans or tariffs or those kinds of things. So when students see these issues and feel like they alone are finding them or only care about them, this is big scale work that shows the trends that we're on. And now we're in this position where, for the first time, a UN plastic treaty on the scale of the biodiversity and climate change treaties is now in its formation phase. So these issues around single-use plastic are not alone. So again, I think it behooves us as educators to switch from saying, it's all in the future, to saying, because people have done this, we're now here, and this is where we want more of this, rather than if we begin to do this. I think it's really important. And these are just some trends that I keep track of on a regular basis. And these are some sites that I use to find evidence-based solutions. And I'm happy to say there are so many more of them, whether in social media or in legacy media. They just cropping up all over the place now, because this solutions journalism is really an important trend. So again, you might want to say in the chat right now, how are you feeling at this moment? And we won't do the poll, we'll just put it in there if you don't mind, or just to think to yourself. Whoopsala. Sorry, I had promised no video, and then there was one. Sorry.
That's okay, Ellen. And
yeah.
we have a question. There's
Yes.
actually a couple of comments for later discussion around resources. So a number of folks said that, they're starting to raise their own awareness on this, but not sure how to address it in the classroom,
Perfect.
addressing the hope gap specifically.
Let's
And
come
then
to
the
there.
question
Good.
that just came through around enforcement of these treaties and regulations, if it's been effective or not.
Yeah, in fact, I was looking at multilateral treaties, environmental treaties not that long ago when I did my PhD. Well, it was a long time ago now, 20 years ago. When I did my PhD, almost all environmental agreements were like 2 or 3 countries around 1 or 2 resources. And then the Biodiversity Convention and the Climate Change Convention, which are, multiple hundreds of signatory countries and massive, like all diversity of life on Earth. And when you look at the effectiveness of these multilateral agreements of many kinds over time, they are very effective. So they're slow, cumbersome, frustrating, but they are globally impactful. So it's really fascinating to watch that kind of research too, and what about them makes them impactful, and what do we need more of in that realm? I wanted to touch on the idea that often when we talk about the ocean and other environmental issues, we think of people, and we should, because we're only responsible for what we are doing, and need to be responsible for that. However, there are 8.7 million other species on Earth, and I think it's very important that we talk about the resilience. So, for example, when we saw this horrifying number of wildfires in Australia, it's almost overwhelming. The scale of those fires. It's true, and those are tied to climate change, and that's a massive issue. However, we also need to see more reporting like this that talks about what happens after those fires. So we aren't left with the impression that there is no resilience in those forests. In fact, there is the capacity within gum trees, eucalyptus trees, for example. They have these things called epicorns, which are when even all of the branches and all of the leaves are burned off, deep within their, under their bark, they're able to pop out these leaves that then start photosynthesizing and healing the trees. And so I'm in no way saying that climate change isn't an issue or that these fires are not horrific. But what I am saying is we also need to know that resilience is also there, and therefore, how do you help reinforce that resilience? And I think that's what Suzanne Simard is doing in the forestry work that she's working on, where she's saying, what if we leave mother trees? What if we, log in these different ways? That is really appreciating the resilience that operates within other systems, in that case, in a resource example. Interesting research like this. Sometimes I'll see these things, like New Scientist is the #1 popular science magazine on Earth, and its articles are almost always directly coming from either the Journal of Science or the Journal of Nature. And when I see things like this, I have to go and look at the original research because I cannot believe it. And again, it's not that mercury pollution is okay, but it's important to know about this. I did a talk not long ago at UBC for the mining faculty, and I was fascinated to see how many students in mining are interested in the recovery, the reclamation of mining sites. That's what they're really interested in, and the use of extremophiles. So these life forms that can live in high heat or high acidity and how extremophiles are used in cleanups. Fascinating. Lots of you will have seen an eagle today, maybe even could see one out of your window right now. An important restoration story, examples of when we stop doing something we know doesn't work, the positive impact it can have. Recovery of species in Europe. And statistics like this. So we know that elephants are a massive conservation story, absolutely big problems with elephants. And it's important to know this, that actually a lot of work on anti-poaching is having a positive impact. And then the kind of ecological economics work, which talks about what is the value of a forest elephant for climate change, for example. And I think we are in a period for the first time ever that I'm aware of, where the Biodiversity Convention and its goals to protect 30% of land and ocean by the year 2030, and the Climate Change Convention with its recognition of nature-based solutions are working in concert. So we're seeing much more of this kind of recognition of, what's the importance of other species in terms of climate change impacts. Tiger shark, elephants, and whales. So, more than $1 million per whale in terms of its impact on carbon capture. So these are really, I find myself in mixed feelings, because I think these animals are inherently valuable to themselves and to the ecosystem. And I see that it is also valuable in a market-based economy to have these kinds of valuations that help to create that 30 by 30 protection. Close to Vancouver, in the Salish Sea, record-breaking years for humpback whales and Bigg's killer whales. I'm also a children's book writer, and I mention this only because in my book, Wild Ideas, I was talking about the creative ways other animals solve problems. Humpback whales will actually, they make bubble nets that they make 10 to 14 whales get together and blow bubbles that capture fish, and then everybody gets more fish. Well, the reason I'm popping this in here is that Fred Sharp, who's a wonderful humpback whale researcher, he says one of the reasons humpback whales are making spectacular recoveries, not just in the Salish Sea, but in populations all over the world, is because they're really good social networkers. So they work really collaboratively together, and when they see something that works, they pick it up fast and they do it. And so I think that's a fascinating idea, that's resilience. And as whale populations rebuild, ecosystems rebuild, and then this kind of work. So here is a beautiful example of all of this coordinated research of where do whales go in the world, to make a map of whale superhighways, which is now being used by the International Marine Organization, which is in charge of shipping, to say, okay, where are these really crucial areas? Because we know shipping strikes is a big issue for whales. So this kind of collective data that allows us to make better choices, and which allows us to make better choices around marine protected areas, because you can see which areas are more important to different species. So this is just, I always put this in because I was lucky enough back in 2009 to work on this project. I wrote the scientific brief to try and convince George Bush to create the world's largest marine protected area. At the time, it was an ecosystem scaled marine protected area, and it is now dwarfed. It is something like the 14th largest on Earth. And that's in, just over 10 years time or 15 years time. So we see, massive increases in marine protected areas. We see this going on very close to shore there in Vancouver. We see this going on. So not just the example I was using from California, but an example much closer to home. And then this, deep sea marine protected areas, which is a very exciting idea. Look at the size of that. Look how small Vancouver Island is. And remember, Vancouver Island is bigger than the Netherlands, So it's exciting to look at this shift. And now, talking about marine protected areas, not within just nation states, but within the high seas. So the oceans between nation state jurisdictions, which is actually the bigger part of the ocean. This is something so dear to my heart, because when I first started working in marine protected areas many, many decades ago, we couldn't even talk about high seas because it was just impossible that this would ever happen. So what a thrilling thing to see happen. And this is a slide I have to update every time I talk, because the number goes up every time. Now, it's not at 30%, which is where it needs to be, but it's moving up. And then now this. So we know that wildlife corridors matter on land. They also matter on the ocean, right? So joining up marine protected areas and more research like this that shows, okay, as you do these protected areas, what are the impacts of it? Ocean Optimism, I know that's the name of the talk, so I thought I'd better put this in. This was just an attempt to crowdsource and share examples of ocean conservation solutions at a time when solutions journalism wasn't really even very active yet. And we didn't really hear about those. And the big discovery for me was when we co-created just the hashtag, that's all we really did. I thought we'd have to go out and find examples and write about them one by one. But really what we discovered is there's so many examples, and people in environmental organizations and science labs and environmental programs knew about them. All they really needed was a gathering place for them. So I wanted to stop here for a second and give you a challenge. So one of the things that happens when you talk about hope is people contact you with projects. And so not long ago, a couple of months ago, I guess, I was invited by a local school in Victoria who wanted me to come to their march for these endangered animals. And they were thinking about the children would all make hats, and then they would have like a kind of a funeral march, you know, as a way of recognizing the importance of these species. So when you look at that, what do you think my response was? Look at the list of animals there. Yeah, most of the animals on that list are not endangered, right? Those animals are actually in recovery mode. And so again, this well-intentioned idea that the way we honor animals is by caring for those. That's a pain story. I feel like it's a pain story. And so I suggested to them that, there are such different ways of interacting with these things. Of course, spending time making self-portraits from, our deep connections to nature. And things like this, working with kids to say, here's a child writing, I find it amazing how humpbacks, they're talking about, they return so quickly from 132 to 1,562 whales, like what does it mean to a child to know about this recovery of humpbacks rather than, replaying a story which isn't a true story. And I'm happy to say they then changed the parade because they already had the hats into a celebration of resiliency. So it's fine, it's fine, but we have to really question what we're saying. Just going to touch briefly on this because it's such an important issue. I try to spend almost all my time outside. I'm only not outside right now because I'm staying in a place and it's actually raining in California, which is unusual. And there's no over area that I could bring my computer, but I try to write outside. I sleep outside, and I try to do almost all my teaching outside. This is, sorry, my thing is jumping here. This is just an example of the clothing that I often have to wear for doing that teaching outside, even when you're just doing it on a computer. And this is my friend Joy and I working during the pandemic. So, and many of you will do this, but there's just so much research now that shows how good this is for ourselves, for our minds and our bodies. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is when we think about engaging from the solutions orientation, people will often ask, what's the number one thing I can do? What should I do? And there are certainly lots of lists, lots of work done by various international bodies that shows plant-based eating, taking transit, riding bicycles, sharing. Sharing is very big. These kinds of things make a big positive impact. And I think it's maybe even more important to think about joining together with others who care about what you care about, however you self-identify. And I just wanted to touch on there, these are really intersectional issues. And so there, whether, no matter how you self-identify, there are groups working on these issues. And I think that's what holds us. That's where we have that sense of camaraderie and agreement around things. I just love this. I just saw this in the most recent issue of Atmos. Here we have a transgender model talking about nature and hope and these non-binary ideas, really a beautiful example. Every major religion on earth has signed a climate emergency declaration. And really thinking about social media. So we're talking about the largest demographic on earth is 25 years of age or younger. the number one place that people in that demographic find their information is on social media. And so we really have to think about this as educators of how are we interacting in these ways and collaborating in intergenerational collaborations. So I have been working really in this area because I think it's so important. And I have been collaborating with Queer Brown Vegan and the Solutions Journalism Network to shift this narrative of doomism online. And I just think that that's the future, is these collaborations where you bring evidence-based work into an arena where it's harder to find that work because we don't have any of the systems in place as we do with legacy media, to pay journalists and things. So social media, people are having to fund themselves in very different ways. And again, I think as a social justice issue, we have to think about, that's why I approached the David Suzuki Institute to find funding to do this, because we have to support those social influencers in their work. And as educators, it's interesting to see that this activism that's happening on social media and within the real world, beyond social media, these things are moving seamlessly. So it's a really important place of interaction and very effective stuff. We're talking about ocean plastic pollution concerns. Mr. Beast has organized these massive ocean cleanup, working with Boy and Slat, who is doing the Great Pacific Garbage Patch cleanup work and is very committed to transparency. You can watch how effective or the various means they're using is. Anyway, they're able to remove an extraordinary amount of garbage as a result of fundraising online, dollar by dollar. So I want to leave you with the idea that emotions are contagious, both face-to-face and online. So when we choose to care about something deeply and we only share a pain story, we may be inadvertently disempowering. Just when we create our course curriculum and we only focus on what's broken, or almost entirely, maybe we have one class on hope, it's not enough. We really need to shift this in that way, because hope is not complacent. It's actually a political decision, because it has an impact on how we engage in the crucial issues of our time. So one last question about how you feel, and if you are interested in these ideas. My book, Hope Matters, really tries to explore these issues, and I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Ellen. And I think, I don't know about everyone else, but I'm feeling very positive about these evidence-based solutions. That's what it's all about. And you had so many examples to share with us. I'm feeling quite peppy and very positive about where we're going. So thank you again, Ellen. What a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, too, for being here.